Chapter 42 of There Is a Tide. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There Is a Tide by Jessie Snaith. Bill looked a peach in his guard's tie, when, at 1:15, he was discovered among the ferns at the Ritz. Mame had no wish to be unduly set up with herself. Nay, she was too wise ever to be so, but there was a happy sense which informed her that she was some advertisement for the new dressmaker, Gwemp. Right up to the knocker. Right up to the nines. Everything just so. Since she had gone to live at Half Moon Street, she had developed taste in clothes. The neat coat frock of navy blue gabardine was the last word in style. The same applied to the dinky little hat of black velvet. A good world, thought Mame, and Bill thought so too, as they ate a delicate but expensive luncheon. And then, at their leisure, they crossed the road and sauntered down a famous street as far as a famous jeweler's, where the ring was duly chosen. Being a marquis, Bill was rather a believer in doing things well. The ring was, therefore, no half-and-half affair, but the last cry of fashion, wonderfully devised of small pearls and diamonds. It cost, no doubt, a pretty figure. What the exact sum was remained a secret between Bill and the jeweler, and there was no happier girl than Mame in the whole of London, when, with that token glittering on her finger, she and her affianced sought again the air of Bond Street. They strolled down Piccadilly. In their glossy elegance, surmounted by faces of healthy Scottish tan, they were decidedly good to look at. Many sympathetic glances were directed upon them by the passers-by. Some people consider that taking one day with another there is a greater pressure of really good-looking people to the square yard in that gentle declivity which ends at Hyde Park Corner than in any stretch of equal length on the wide earth. The type of beauty there represented is so honest, so upstanding, so cheerfully simple, yet so immaculately dressed. Bill and his young lady did no dishonour to Piccadilly North Side, and had they had eyes for aught but each other, they might have learned how much they were admired. In point of fact, Mame did happen to catch the eye of one little girl, remarkably like herself of a few short months ago, who, with her satchel containing heaven knew what secret ambitions, was on her way back to her work. She was a resolute and plucky bit of a thing, withal a little peaked and pale, a little tired and a little bored. And there was more than mere admiration in the glance which envisaged Mame, her clothes and her escort. There was a wistful envy. Yes, honey, thought Mame complacently, you do well to envy me. Just now I am the happiest girl in London. It all seems too good to be true. I feel sure there must be a catch in it somewhere. But the glow of feeling continued as far as the park gates, where they turned in, and the day, being wonderfully bright and mild, as it often is in England towards the middle of September, they sat on garden chairs for 2 solid hours, at a point equidistant between the Achilles statue and Knightsbridge Barracks, where the Pinks were now in residence. Those 2 hours of prattling to Bill and of Bill prattling to her, Mame never forgot. Her sense of everything seemed to grow richer and deeper. Wasn't it Hamlet or some other wise guy who would put it over in the office calendar that heaven and earth held more things than he dreamed of? That was exactly how Mame felt now. She could hardly believe that she herself was she. Was this the little hick who a year ago had hardly been 10 miles away from Cowbarn, Iowa, in all her young life? Was this the little mucker New York had laughed at? She was far too practical to believe in fairies, but she could not deny the feeling that a spell was at work. Bill was charming to sit by and talk to. He made not the slightest pretence of being a highbrow. Out of doors was his special hobby. An easy-going sportsman was what he looked, and that sure was what he was. They discussed the immediate future, wondered when and how and where they should tie the knot, and so on. I'll nip along to the Button Club presently, the box with the windows we passed just now, and write a line to my mother. You haven't met her yet, have you? She's a great dear, she really is, even if she does live all the year round in Shropshire. I'll tell her we want to get married as soon as we can. And as we are both quiet, homely sort of birds, We shan't want much in the way of a wedding." Mame was all in favor. No doubt some of the folks would want to be there, but the quieter the better. She was never one for display, and when Bill declared he would not mind how soon they were "spliced," with this also she was in cordial agreement. These were moments of real happiness. And yet, there was just one moment of sorts. After they had sat a full 2 hours on the garden chairs, absorbed in the contemplation of each other and their future plans, they got up and made a move in the direction of tea. It could be purchased and consumed in an open-air enclosure thoughtfully provided by the London County Council. They were in the act of crossing the park's central artery when Mame's eye was caught by a gently gliding limousine. It was a wonderful dingus, the latest word, with chauffeur and footman whose liveries matched the peerless machine. 2 ladies were seated inside. Both, however, appeared to be gazing ostentatiously in another direction. "Say, look, honey, Gwendolyn Childwick. Is that our mommer?" Bill's answer was a rather amused, but quite indifferent yes. "Mommer carries a bit of sale, I always think. Some of these Fifth Avenue queens do, they say. Very rich, I suppose." Mame had an odd fluttering of the nerves, for which she couldn't quite account. "I forget how many millions of dollars, but something pretty tall." "Well, they needn't treat us as if we were just dirt." "Didn't see us." Bill took an obvious and common-sense view of a quite trivial incident. "No, they just didn't." Mame showed venom. "But I guess they'd have seen you soon enough if I hadn't been with you." In the particular circumstances, it was not a very judicious thing to have said, but even Mademoiselle Lespinasse may nod on occasion. Not, of course, that it really mattered. Bill seemed absolutely indifferent. If one happens to be an old, established British marquis, one is apt to take things as they come. Not his to reason why Gwendolen and her mamma looked pointedly in an opposite direction. Bill calmly brushed the incident aside, but Mame lacked something of his detachment. Her gaiety grew suddenly less. That glimpse of Gwendolen seemed to cast a shadow over the rosy prospect. Why it should do so, Mame did not know. What was Miss Three-Ply Flannelette and all her millions of dollars to either of them now? Still, there was no denying that the cup of tea did not taste as good as Mame had expected. Perhaps it was that a faint cloud had crossed the sun of her great happiness, although, so far as the September blue was concerned, hardly a puff was visible. Yet, in spite of the glory of the day, a touch of autumn began to steal upon the air. They didn't sit long over their tea. Mame felt in duty bound to return to the day's rather neglected work. Bill, moreover, had a very important letter to write to his mother. But they continued to enjoy each other's company all the way back along Rotten Row and up by Hamilton Place, where Bill, after duly making an appointment at the same highly convenient spot for the morrow, entered the Button Club to do the deed. Mame walked slowly along to Half Moon Street. For some reason, she was feeling more anxious, more excited than she cared about when she entered the flat. She shed her gloves and took off her hat, and then she went into the small room in which most of their work was done and resolutely confronted the typewriter. Violet had not yet come in. This was fortunate. Mame felt in need of a respite in which to collect her thoughts. For the hour was at hand when the dramatic announcement must be made. Violet would have to know, and she had better know now. There was really no reason, Mame argued with her somewhat fluttered self, why she should worry. It was not as if she had been guilty of anything dishonorable. Violet was not going to like it, of course. Beyond a doubt she had set her heart on Bill marrying Gwendolyn Childwick. Still, that was merely a question of Gwendolyn's dollars. Bill obviously did not want to marry mere dollars. So from that point of view, it was doing him a simple kindness to save him from that fate. Dollars are not everything. Besides, as one of the Johns in the office calendar had explicitly stated, in love and war all is fair. Even if Bill's sister took it amiss, Mame felt she need not reproach herself. Clucking away at the typewriter, she hardened her heart. The time was now. It was her duty to break the news before the world was a day older. While she nursed this growing resolution, she heard the front door open, and then came Violet's light but decided step in the hall. A minute later, when she came into the room, she lacked nothing of that genial insouciance which Mame so much admired. But as Mame glanced up, she was a little chilled by her eyes. The absence of real friendliness, which once had verged on affection, was now complete. "Where have you been to, my pretty maid?" The question was humorously put. Had Violet been dying, it would still have been a point of honor with her to put things humorously. "Getting engaged to be married, please, mum," she said. The retort was quick. It was also bold. Mame was wise enough to appreciate that this particular bull would have to be taken by the horns. Violet was startled. It was not a bit of use dissembling. She was really startled. Mame, besides, once she had begun upon the cold, drawn truth, was no believer in half measures. She lifted her left hand from the typewriter and flashed its new brilliancy before the astonished eyes of her questioner. "How beautiful!" There was nothing in the gay voice to betray anxiety. All the same, a slight change of color rather gave Bill's sister away. "My dear, you have told me nothing of this." Mame could not help admiring her friend's fortitude. "Tell me, who is the happy man?" "Mean to say you can't guess?" Each syllable expressed incredulity. "How should one?" Violet kept up the game pretty well, but the note of innocence was pitched just a shade high. Evidently she felt it necessary to play for time. "Ah, shucks, honey! Cut it out!" In the stress of pure emotion, Mame had a sudden relapse to the primitive manner of her fathers. "Who do you think it can be? The Prince of Wales?" Violet's heart was sinking, sinking, but she contrived to keep up the farce. Not a ghost of an idea. "Take 3 guesses." But Violet only took one. "You don't mean to say you—" All pretense was at an end. Bill's sister spoke with a slow reproachfulness that caused Mame to feel decidedly uncomfortable. But she determined to put the best face she could on the matter. "Why not?" she laughed. "Do you blame me?" "Blame you?" The note in the disciplined voice sounded odd. Violet's face and tone hardened in a way that Mame found rather alarming. "What you really deserve is a thorough good beating." For one vital moment it looked as if this really was going to be a case of teeth and claws. But of a sudden Violet took herself strongly in hand. Never in her life had it been so difficult for Violet to wear the mask of indifference. She would have liked to have killed this marauder. But in her heart she knew that she herself was almost wholly responsible for a tragic situation. She had been properly punished for the levity of her approach to certain conventions. How could she have been paid out better for playing the fool? However, this was not a moment for self-castigation. She must act. The matter was so horribly serious that it hardly bore thinking about. All the tact, all the diplomacy she could muster had now to be brought into play. A trying pause threatened to intensify the awkwardness of things. "And then," said Violet, in a tone that would keep hardening in spite of herself, "before you mention this to anyone, I hope you will see my mother. Will you promise that?" Mame did not answer at once. Her instinct was to ask Bill. Perhaps Violet may have guessed as much, for she was not to be put off. She made her demand again, and with an urgency quite new in Mame's experience of her. This was a new Violet altogether. "Please, you must promise." The gay voice had grown coldly resolute. "Something is due to us, you know." There was cause to regret those words as soon as they were uttered, for their effect was to stiffen Mame's feathers. "We'll leave that to him, I guess." There was resentment in the answer. Considerable strength of will was needed for Violet to withhold the remark that Bill was a perfect fool, but she was able to fight down the raging tempest. "I am going to telegraph for my mother to come up at once. And, in the name of our friendship, I ask you to keep the engagement a close secret until you have seen her." Mame was inclined to resent the tone, but lurking somewhere in her crude yet complex mind was that rather unfeminine sense, fair play. She could not quite forget, after all, how much she owed to Violet. In the circumstances, she had a right to demand this of her. "Well, honey, I'll do what you say," drawled Mame with light drollery. "But I can't answer for that little bird." Lady Violet's eyes sparkled rather grimly, but she managed to keep her voice under control. "No, you can't, of course." By a mighty effort, she got back on to the plane she was determined to occupy. "But if you can persuade him to hold his tongue for a day or two, you'll be helping everybody. Yourself, not least of all." The depth of the argument was a point beyond Mame. She could not pretend to be versed in the ways of the hothouse world she was about to enter, but evidently her friend had powerful reasons. Even if she was cutting up pretty rough, there would be no harm in humouring her. Nay, it would be wise. Besides, as Mame's conscience was careful to insist, it was right to make this concession. No need to stand too much on dignity, particularly as she had a real regard for Violet, and so must do nothing to embitter their relations. "I'll do all I can, anyway, to keep it a secret until I've seen your mommer," said Mame generously. End of Chapter 42. Read by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona, August 14, 2024.
Chapter 43 of There Is a Tide. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There Is a Tide by J.C. Snaith. Chapter 43. The next day, about 6 o'clock in the evening, Lady Violet was sitting alone, with some very hard and rueful thoughts, when Davis, with a face of doom, portentously announced the Marchioness of Kidderminster. She had come up post-haste from Shropshire. On the top of Violet's urgent but cryptic telegram had arrived an amazing letter from Bill. Their mother, on the spur of the moment, had made up her mind to catch the 11:15 at Millfield, which, in turn, would pick up the express at Shrewsbury. And as she succeeded as a rule in doing things upon which she set her mind, why, here she was. The greetings of mother and daughter were affectionate, but they were sorry. Both felt that a catastrophe had occurred, and it was of such magnitude that they were quite stunned by its force. "A little American, you say, without any money?" Lady Kidderminster quite correctly had the sense of what her daughter had said. Those indeed were her words. "It's terrible," said Lady Kidderminster piteously. From her point of view, it was. Both ladies were much inclined to blame themselves, and also to blame each other. Lady Kidderminster could not help reproaching Violet for turning loose such a dangerous creature upon a simple, unprotected society. In future, perhaps she would be more careful in her choice of friends. Violet retaliated by saying that her mother ought never to have let the summer go by without simply making Bill marry Gwendolen Childwick. Wretched boy! It was the only marriage he could make, if he was to keep his head above water. However, it was no use repining. There was no time for that. Mother and daughter were both people of resolution, and they had great common sense. Something would have to be done to stop this ruinous affair. But they asked themselves what? Already it had gone much too far. It would be impossible for Bill to back out now. "Our only chance, my dear," said Violet slowly and forcefully, "and I own it's a very slender one, is to see what can be done with this Miss Durrance. But if she's as horrid and pushful as you say, she will be the last person in the world to give him up." "Horrid she is not." Mame's friend spoke judicially. "Quite a nice little thing in her way. Personally, I like her very much, but as a wife for Bill, she is unthinkable, particularly as she has to earn her own living. All the less likely to give him up." Lady Kidderminster was doleful indeed. Still, the only hope they had was to act as if that possibility still remained. "It's so slender that it seems pretty hopeless." That was Lady Violet's candid opinion. But they must try something. The thing was so tragic, they could not possibly take it lying down. They were discussing the catastrophe in all its painful bearings, when Mame blundered into the hornet's nest. She had been walking with Bill in the park. She was still feeling very happy, if just a little anxious. And when she abruptly opened the door and came into the drawing room, her thoughts being elsewhere, it did not occur to her that she would find Lady Kidderminster seated in it. Mame knew at a glance who she was. Bill was remarkably like his mother. This dame was quite handsome, even if her face was a bit worn. She was also stately. But as Mame immediately discovered, she was accessible, kindly, human. She got up as soon as Mame entered. Before Mame had time to display embarrassment or shyness, the good lady offered her hand. And then, as Mame was in the act of taking it, Bill's mother gave her one quick but covert glance, which had not a trace of hostility. Somewhere amid Mame's infinite complexity was a longing for affection. But already she had steeled herself for a display of cattishness. However, there was nothing unkind about Bill's mother, sharp though Mame's instinct was to detect it. There was nothing unkind in Lady Violet either. Instinctively, Mame knew that both these women must be hating her like poison, and it was almost miraculous how they managed to cover up their feelings. For 5 minutes or so, Bill's mother and sister talked about him pleasantly and brightly and entertainingly. He was such a dear, dear fellow, his mother said, but he was quite irresponsible. Agreeably and rather wittily, she gave anecdotes of Bill's childhood. She had quite a fund of these, and they were told so well with such point and humor that Mame was really amused. The prospective daughter-in-law could not help admiring Lady Kidderminster. Her talk had much of Lady Violet's charm, with a Victorian polish and correctness in place of the modern slang whose abundance in the daughter, old-fashioned people were apt to deplore. What the mother lacked in mordancy she made up for in kindliness, and those manners of the heart which at all times are sure of their appeal. Mame was quick to respond. She was grateful for the way in which this lady with the most beguiling voice she had ever listened to exercised these gifts for her benefit. The meeting might have been so awkward. Nay, it might have been downright unpleasant. But Bill's mother carried things off in a style which Mame considered to be perfection. For one thing, Lady Kay did not force the note. There was no welcoming her into the nest among her chickens. Mame was shrewdly waiting for that, because that was where this nice, good, clever dame would rather have fallen over the mat. But she was too genuine. There was a certain reserve, a certain dignity behind all that she said to Mame. Even if there was nothing constrained, still less was there anything effusive. It was the golden mean. Miss Durrance was frankly accepted as Bill's affianced, even if she was very far from being the particular girl his mother had chosen for him. But please, you will promise, will you not, to refrain from speaking of this matter to anyone until I have the opportunity of discussing it fully with my son. The careful phrases were so urgent that Mame, who did not want to give any such promise, felt the best she could do was to make it. Lady Kay thanked her gravely. "And I wonder, my dear," it was the first time the stately dame had addressed Mame as "my dear," "if you feel inclined to come down to Shropshire for a few days. It might interest you to see the sort of life we lead." Politely, Mame was sure that it would. "When can you come?" Mame winged a glance to her partner in the newspaper world. The acceptance of the invitation chiefly depended on the attitude of Celimene. "No time like the present, is there?" was that attitude promptly and concisely expressed. But Mame's quaint honesty raised a smile in both ladies. "'Tisn't fair, honey, to leave you here alone to do all the digging. I can plow a lonely furrow for a week at any rate, and if I find I can't, I'll get Gertie Smith to give me a hand. You must go back to Shropshire with my mother. We both so want to know what you think of the Towers." Mame was puzzled by this cordiality, but she was very keen to see Warlington Towers, that stately English home for which the future would be hers. There was nothing in the manner of mother and daughter to suggest that she would not be an immensely welcome guest. Reassured, almost in spite of herself, by all this seeming friendliness, Mame asked when Lady Kidderminster proposed to return her home. "Tomorrow, my dear, by the first train. I'm such a country mouse, and even one day in London makes a hole in one's purse." "Well, I don't think I can go tomorrow." "But of course you can." Lady Violet was definite. "And you must. No scrimshanking. You must go down with my mother tomorrow morning by the 9:50 from Paddington, the best train of the day." Mame was still inclined to resist having her mind made up for her in this way, but Celimene was resolute. "My mother will be quite hurt if you back out now. Besides," with a laugh, "it'll be so much better to go and get it over." "But," protested Mame. However, it was not a bit of use. Lady Violet had such a powerful habit of making people's minds up for them. End of chapter 43. Read by Kimberly Bonin. Chapter 44 of There Is a Tide. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There Is a Tide by Jessie Snaith. Chapter 44. It happened, therefore, that the very next morning Mame found herself travelling down to Shropshire in the company of Lady Kidderminster. Odd and unexpected as the journey was, she was a little inclined to be annoyed with herself for having allowed Mommer and Lady Violet to hustle her so peremptorily into undertaking it. There was a weakness in such yielding. And to a practical go-getter who knew the value of the will, this was not a good sign. The first thing she would have to study as the wife of Bill must be the art of standing up to her in-laws. These were clever women, not a doubt about it. Evidently, they were versed in the most important of all problems: how to get your own way. They had force and they had skill, had Mommer and Lady Violet. They didn't let you see their hands, but just set quietly to work and made you do the things they wanted. She was a little simp to let them put one over on her like that. Still, why worry? There was no reason why she should not be seated opposite Mommer in the darned old Great Western Pullman. She was real nice, was Mommer, as easy as pie. All the same, her daughter-in-law-to-be shrewdly guessed that she was not just the simple old shoe that she looked. Even before they had reached the first stop, which was Reading, Mame had made a private vow that as far as Mommer was concerned, she would keep her eyes skinned and watch out. The journey was quite pleasant, all the way from Paddington to Shrewsbury, where they left the express and took a local train to Millfield, the nearest station to Worlington Towers. The lady whose charge Mame found herself persisted steadily in being charming. Mame could not help liking her. Seen as it were from a distance, Mommer's stateliness was a little alarming. But at close range, in friendly and intimate talk, all fear of it seemed to go. There were no surprises. Everything went agreeably and well. It was when they got off the train finally at Millfield that the surprises began. There was a 5-mile drive to the Towers, as Mame had been told, and she had rather confidently expected it to be performed in an elegant motor, with 2 servants, but nothing of the kind. In the Millfield station yard, a 1-horse brougham awaited them. It was decidedly well kept, but it looked out of date. And although the coachman wore a smart cockade and had the face of an ancestral portrait, no brisk footman shared the seat by his side. An obsequious porter and a rural station master, who was even more obsequious, ushered them into the brougham's rather stuffy interior. It was plain from the manner of these officials that even if Mommer did cling to the old modes of travel, she was a power in this corner of the land. Still, Mame continued to be a bit surprised by the 1-horse brougham. Yet this was no more than a prelude to the far bigger surprise that was in store. After the elderly horse had clip-clopped along the dusty byroads for some time, Mame caught a sudden glimpse of a noble set of towers, bosomed high in tufted trees, as a poetic John had expressed it in the office calendar. There was also a fine park full of deer with high stone walls around it. Worlington Towers, I guess. There was a thrill in Mame's voice as she pointed enthusiastically through the carriage window. Lady Kidderminster said, yes. The note in her voice sounded the reverse of enthusiastic. At that moment, they came upon some beautiful wrought iron gates, with an ancient coat of arms in the middle, flanked by a pair of stone pillars, each with a fabulous winged monster upon the top. Beyond the gates was a porter's lodge, and then a vista of glorious trees in the form of a long avenue, which led straight to the doors of the famous mansion. It's just too lovely! Mame clapped her hands. She quite expected the one-horse brougham to stop at those magnificent gates, all picked out in black and gold, and turn into that wonderful avenue. But it did nothing of the kind. It went on by the side of the high stone walls, which shut out the view of the towers completely. Don't you live there? Mame was a little puzzled, and perhaps a shade anxious. Lady Kidderminster sighed gently. We don't live there now, my dear. Oh, breathed Mame. Somehow she felt rather let down. The old horse clip-clopped along by the grassy marge of the interminable and forbidding stone walls, until he reached a tiny village. In the middle was a neat public house, with a roof of straw thatch, and its ancient sign, the Traherne Arms, much stained by the weather. Past this the brougham went, a couple of 100 yards or so, and then turned in on the left, through a swing gate and along a carriage drive. At the end of the drive was a house built of stone. It was a good, honest-looking place, and by its style was old. But compared with the pomp and glory of the towers, it was quite small. Nay, as Mame was forced to view it, this house was a trifle poor. Here the brougham stopped. It was the end of their journey. The place which Lady Kidderminster had occupied for the last 5 years was called the Dower House. It was comfortable enough, and everything in it was in such perfect taste that it was only Mame's lively anticipation of the towers and their magnificence which lent it an aura of inferiority. Really, the Dower House was charming. It had the loveliest things. There was a view of distant hills from its bedroom windows. And at the back of the house was an old-world garden, a rare pleasance of plants and shrubs and very ancient trees. If the towers had not caught Mame's imagination, she would have considered the Dower House just elegant. At dinner, which was at 8 o'clock, and to Mame's robust appetite, was a meal at once meager and inadequate. There was only one other besides the hostess. This was a Miss Carruthers, a young old body, tall and faded and thin, who spoke in a slow, rather peeved voice, which sounded frightfully aristocratic. She seemed kindly and well-meaning, but she was dull, terribly dull. Even Lady Kidderminster seemed inclined to yield to the atmosphere of Miss Carruthers. Anyhow, by dinner time, a good deal of her metropolitan sparkle had fled. Mame hoped, as she swallowed the thin soup and the minute portions of fish and chicken, the regular old John of a butler with wonderful manners and side whiskers, handed to her at carefully regulated intervals, that the absence of sparkle was only going to be temporary. But there was nothing on the table stronger than lemonade to excite it, and zip of some kind was certainly needed. However, it was not forthcoming at the table or in the drawing-room afterwards, where no fire was in the rather cavernous grate, although mid-September evenings in Shropshire are apt to be chill. There was neither electricity nor gas throughout the house. And when Mame, following the example of the other ladies, chose a candle from among a number laid out on a table in the hall, and descended solemnly to her bed, she felt desolate. Somehow things were not as she had expected to find them. Just what those expectations had been, she was unable to say. But they had certainly included the towers. All the same, she slept. She was young and healthy, and the pulse of life beat high. And she had a forward-looking mind. But in the present case, the habitual hope of a morrow more alluring came to naught. The dower house did not seem to improve on acquaintance. It was dull. No use mincing it. It was dull. Lady Kidderminster continued to be kindness itself. Miss Carruthers was also kind, but they only seemed to converse on formal subjects, and in a rather perfunctory way. Then the food. It was beautifully cooked and served, and what there was of it was of the best quality, yet in Miss Durrance it left a void. A factor in their dullness, no doubt, was the absence of Lady Kidderminster's family. Violet, of course, was in London, and of the two young ones, Doris was in her first year at Cambridge, and Marjorie at school at Worthing. When those two pickles come here for the holidays, we are much more lively, aren't we, Mildred? Mildred, Miss Carruthers, who agreed with Lady Kidderminster in most things, agreed in this. After a rather dispiriting breakfast, in which Mame had to be content with a boiled egg, some poor coffee, some thin toast, and an elegant spoonful of jam, she took the air of the domain with Miss Carruthers. Like everything else about the place, the air of domain was in good quality, yet it did not seem to be exhilarating. Mame felt inclined to fix some of the responsibility upon Miss Carruthers. She was good as gold, but she wanted pep. In the course of this ordeal in the garden, Mame's great disappointment once more recurred. She could not forget the towers. Their absence filled her with a sense of grievance. Why don't Lady Kay live at the big house? She put the question frankly. Some place that I guess I'd want to live there if I owned it. Miss Carruthers hesitated a moment, and then said it in that plaintive voice which was already beginning to get on Mame's nerves. Cousin Lucy can't afford to do that. She's been so hit by the war. The towers eat money. One has to be rich to keep up with a place of that kind. She isn't rich, then? Dear, no. What'll she do with that old place? There was keen disappointment in Mame's tone. Cousin Lucy, I believe, has not decided yet. At present, the tower is let to some rich Americans. Any I know? Asked Mame. From her manner, it might have been a hobby of hers to specialize in rich Americans. It would do this dame no harm to think so, anyway. The slow, plaintive answer of Miss Carruthers was unexpected, and it was startling. You may know them. I believe they go about in London a good deal. Some people called Childwick. Childwick? Mame gave a slight gasp. Have they a girl named Gwendolen? Yet there was no need to ask. She knew. So plaintive grew the voice of Miss Carruthers that Mame longed to shake her. Gwendolen is their only child, a great heiress. Mame felt something turn inside her heart. She bit her lip, and then she gave a little snort of defiance. Miss Carruthers sighed long and grievously. End of chapter 44, read by KimberlyB.
Chapter 45 of There Is a Tide. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There Is a Tide by J.C. Snaith. Section 45. The knowledge which came in its fullness to Mame, in an after-luncheon talk with Lady Kidderminster, that the Towers was let to the Childwicks on a lease of 7 years, with an option of purchase, did nothing to stem the growing tide of her gloom. She might have guessed, but the recognized fact hit her hard. The Childwicks of all people, that supercilious queen, to get away with the whole bag of tricks. Lady K was quite candid. She had the same openness in discussing high finance as in less intimate affairs of life. Since the war, they had simply been hanging on by their eyelids, as it were. The Scotch property had gone. So had the property in Lancashire. The townhouse was let, also to the Childwicks, those providential folk who had lately decided to make England their home. Everybody thought it so fortunate to have such good tenants for the Towers, people who could not only afford to keep up the place in the old way, but who were likely to take a permanent interest in it. Miss Durrance was constrained to think so, too. As she peered into the eyes of Bill's mother, she could not help admiring her fortitude. How this dame must loathe her, little interloper! What plans she had wrecked! Yet there was nothing about this woman, and there never had been, to give the least inkling of what her real feelings were towards her. Not once, it was true, since Mame's arrival at the Dower House, had Lady Kidderminster mentioned Bill, the other queer old pet, that Miss Carruthers had also refrained from mentioning him. Otherwise all was ease and charm and friendliness, although it sure had a trick of fizzling into the dead alive. This quality of not being quite on the earth, so to speak, was not confined to the inmates of the Dower House. It was shared by the friends and neighbors. Screams of all kinds seemed to make a point of turning up about tea-time. Almost invariably, they were of Mame's own sex, and such clothes as they wore, and such comic one-horse shays as for the most part they came in. Frightfully well-bred they were, with real court manners, full of ceremonial. Had good Lady K been England's queen, these dear old buzzards could not have treated her with more deference. It was the air these callers had of being half alive that most impressed Mame. Her mind went back to the tabbies of Farthingay House, at whose hands she had endured long weeks of boredom. These friends of the family were a different breed of tabby. They were politer, gentler, less inclined to scratch, but their faces were just as pinched and bloodless, and their style of dressing quite as odd. Such drolls as they were, with their long-tailored maids and stiff-boned net collars, and their queer hats and trinkets, and stout boots with very flat heels. They looked depressing, and they were depressing. Their talk in the main was of bulbs. Mame was not in the least interested in bulbs. She could raise no enthusiasm over what these funnyments were going to put in the spring. These gardeners, inoffensive and well-meaning though they were, bored Mame to tears. If this was the social life of an English county, she opined she was the sort of mouse that would stay in the town. 3 days of the Dower House began to tell on Miss Durrance. It may have been the food, the people, a peculiarity of the air, but she began to feel as lacking in zip as the friends and neighbors. At the mere sight of them she had an inclination to weep, and strange to say, at the sight of her, 1 or 2 of these old things, who evidently were pretty deep in the family confidence, seemed inclined to do the same. One old pet, indeed, with just a shade more kick than the rest. Miss Carruthers said she had been a bedchamber woman to Queen Victoria, managed to convey a hint to Miss Durrance that the friends and neighbors could only regard her in the light of a national calamity. All this was discouraging. Even had there been no thoughts of Gwendolen Childwick to disturb Maine o' nights, this visit to Bill's mother would hardly have been a bed of roses. She missed sadly the brisk life, the gay companionship of London. Here was nothing doing. From early morn till dewy eve, there was nothing doing. She dipped into a few old-fashioned novels. She read the Morning Post, which was not delivered until the afternoon. She was initiated into various games of patience by the kindly but mournful Miss Carruthers. She strolled about the garden with Lady Kidderminster, and learned to give an opinion on the few remaining asters, chrysanthemums, and dahlias. But somehow you could not call it being alive. By now, moreover, there was beginning to arise in Mame a feeling of remorse. It was not an emotion she would ever have suspected herself of harboring. Practical go-getters have not, as a rule, much time for remorse. They are usually too busy. Besides, where was the use? Remorse never cut ice since the world began. To make matters worse, on the morning of the 5th day came a letter from Bill. He wrote with far less than his usual optimism. In fact, he was just a bit troubled. He had been talking things over with his mother, whom he had seen when she came up to town, and she had said the family finances were in such a tangle that if he married Mame, there would be absolutely no money for a separate establishment. She took rather a gloomy view of the whole matter, but personally he was quite willing to chance it if Mame was. He sent her heaps of love, and he was counting the hours for her return, and he thought that in the circumstances the sooner they were spliced, the better. The letter was full of affection and humor, yet Mame could not rid her mind of the feeling that breakers were ahead. She was perturbed, and something which happened in the course of that very afternoon deepened a sense of unrest. "Do you care to come and see the Towers, my dear?" asked Lady Kidderminster, as they lingered over their afternoon lunch and coffee. "The Childwigs are away, but I'm sure the housekeeper, Mrs. Norris, will not mind your looking over the house, if it will interest you." Nothing would interest Mame more. "So glad. We will go along presently. It is such a good day for a walk." The day was really good, one of those soft, mildly summer days of late September that lure one so genially into the open. From the Dower House to the Towers, door to door, was just a mile, and Mame, sauntering with Lady Kidderminster, found the pilgrimage rather enjoyable. Her hostess was still very kind and friendly, even if an inward weight seemed to be bearing her down. Mame longed to speak of Bill. She would like to have drawn Mummer on the subject of when they would be able to marry, yet to butt in upon that vexed question might entirely spoil the pleasure of their stroll. Mame was impressed by the Towers. She felt justified in calling it a palace. It certainly was a wonderful house, one of the oldest and finest in England, and very well kept. A lovely park of many rich woodland acres gave it just the setting that it needed. In spite of Mame's determination to remain a democrat at heart, she could not overcome a slight feeling of awe as they passed through the lodge gates, so impressively emblazoned, and walked slowly along the glorious avenue that led to the Traherne home. The place had such an air. Fancy having it for one's very own to live in. She was entitled, in a sense, to a feeling of proprietorship, yet only too well did she know that she did not in the least match up with Warlington Towers. After all, she could not help thinking ruefully as they came up to the main entrance with doors of solid black oak. She was the merest nobody, a little newspaper girl, a sharp-witted adventuress, who had not even put herself through college. Who was Mame Durrance, the rejected of New York and London, that she should fix herself into such a frame? It was wrong for a go-getter to have these ideas, but there was something in the grandeur, the style, the solidity of this mansion which had stood just like that since the time of the Tudors, which kind of put one over on you. If you had any feelings at all, if you had a streak of imagination, however slight, a vein of idealism, however weak, a tendency to uplift or inconveniences of that kind, this house was bound to get you thinking. They learned from the housekeeper that the Childwicks were expected next week, when a large party would assemble for the shooting. But Mame was not impressed by the news. That girl Gwendolen, for all her dollars and her airs, was almost as much an interloper. What was three-ply flannelette, anyway? Not so much better, was it, than writing for the press? Bitter thoughts accompanied Mame through the nobly proportioned rooms, up the majestic staircase, and then down again to the noblest room of all. It seemed vast, that particular room. The sense of its magnitude came out and hit you as you entered. The view from its great windows was unforgettable, but it was the room itself and the things it contained that made it so memorable. Tapestries, sofas, cabinets, chairs, tables, lovely bric-a-brac and candelabra. All were perfect in their kind and united in ministry to the higher perfection of which they formed a part. It was the pictures on the walls that gave perhaps the biggest thrill. Portraits mostly. Lely's, Kneller's, and those old Johns of the 18th century who knew how to put historical folks upon canvas. Among the famous guys in steel breastplates and periwigs, and contemporary Janes in ruffs and powder, and what-not, was a picture of a young man in knee breeches and silk stockings, and a stiff flounced coat with a sword, who might have been Bill. The resemblance was astonishing. Had Bill exchanged his modern tailor for that funny yet superbly picturesque rig? That is just how he would have looked. Mame was so struck by this likeness that she stopped to gaze at the words at the foot of the gilt frame. William, 3rd Marquis of Kidderminster, by Sir Peter Lely. Yes, it was the real thing, this picture. But what, after all, was it compared to the room it was in, and the harmony of which it was a symbol? History, romance, power seemed all around. Again the spirit of place got Mame thinking. It was the gentle, low voice of Lady Kidderminster that brought her slowly back to the present and to her own self. Shall we rest a moment, my dear? Here in the sun. This is always my favorite spot. How one loves a room facing south. There is more real warmth here than anywhere else in the house. As Lady Kidderminster spoke, she sat down on a large, high-backed sofa, very choicely carved, which was placed immediately below Lely's 3rd Marquis. She made a place beside her for Mame, who sat down too. There the sun was very pleasant, as it streamed in through the great window opposite. The trees of the park could be seen, and the deer browsing under them. Not so much as the ticking of a clock broke the rapt stillness. What a peace there was upon everything! What order! What a hushed solemnity! It was like being in a cathedral. The aura of this room, in its grandeur and stateliness, was overpowering. Mame was seldom at a loss for words, but seated on this sofa by the side of Lady Kidderminster, she felt a little shy of the sound of her own voice. Somehow it didn't seem to belong. She waited for her companion to say something. Those sweet and quiet tones went so much better with the carpets and the pictures and the scene beyond those windows. Suddenly Mame grew aware that the hand next hers had taken it in its clasp. Then very softly and quietly Bill's mother began to talk. Her beautiful low voice, in its ordered perfection, was as much a part of those surroundings as all the other things of which Mame could not help being sensible. Yet the words it wove soon began to press upon her heart. In a fashion of curious simplicity, which revealed everything in the most practical and matter-of-fact way, Bill's mother showed what an effort she had made to hold on to this inheritance. Everybody had hoped that he would marry Miss Childwick. She was deeply in love with him, and there was a time only a short month or so ago when it was thought that he was in love with her. A marriage had been almost arranged for the early summer, yet for some trivial reason it had been deferred. And now, the gentle tones deepened into tragedy. It would never take place, and Bill would have to give up the last and dearest of his possessions. Great sacrifices had been made to keep things going against the time when he should marry. They owed it to him to do that, and he, dear fellow, owed it not to those who were proud to make sacrifices, but to the order of things so long established, of which he was the clow, to marry in a direction that would ensure their maintenance. "You see, my dear," said Lady Kidderminster, and for the first time a faint gleam of humor lit that lovely voice of ever-deepening tragedy, "it is not that we own places like the Towers. They own us. It is Bill's duty to those who have made this old house what it is." She waved a gentle hand to those solemn assenting walls to keep it in the state to which it has pleased Providence to call it. "I hope you appreciate, my dear, what a dreadful wrench it is going to be, not only for us, but for this old house, with so many historical associations, to pass into other hands." Only too well was Mame able to appreciate that. The streak of imagination in her had never been so uncomfortable as at that painful moment. "I simply cannot bear to think of his losing all this," Bill's mother went on. "I simply cannot bear to think of all this losing him. They need each other. They were created for each other. They can never be as they were if they are allowed to drift apart. The Childwicks are excellent people, and they have a lien on this house, which may be exercised if dear Gwendolen does not marry Bill. They will, I'm sure, do the place no dishonor, but I, for one, cannot bear to think of such a break in a long tradition. The Towers expects the head of the family to do his duty by it, in the way of his forebears, who made it the thing it is." Mame did not speak. Not only was she seeing certain things at a new angle, she was also seeing the world in general in a new way. The process was distinctly irksome. "Any girl who really cares for him," Lady K went on with that candor which to Mame was so surprising, "will understand what life exacts of him, will understand where his duty lies." In the silence that followed these words, Mame hardly ventured to look at the face of the woman who sat by her side, but she saw that Lady Kidderminster's eyes were wet. This was a brave woman. It was impossible not to respect her point of view. Indeed, seated in that room, with all those associations clustering about it, there seemed to be only one way of looking at things, and that was the way of Bill's mother. End of Chapter 45. Recording by John Brandon.
Chapter 46 of There Is a Tide. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There Is a Tide by J.C. Snaith. Mame returned to London after an absence of exactly 1 week. Seldom had she been more eager for anything than to exchange the rather dreary stuffiness of the Dower House for the life and bustle of the town. Yet the Mame Durrance who had left Paddington a week ago was not the same person who came back to that terminus. Something had happened to her in the meantime. As yet she did not quite know what the something was, but there were the beginnings of a new habit of introspection in her, and from this she learned that she was in the throes of change. Life, somehow, was not quite as she had left it. She seemed to see it with new eyes. Even the buses and the taxis and the faces of the passers-by were different from what they had been a week ago. They seemed to strike her in a new way. It was as if the rather trite and funny old world she had always lived in had become suddenly enlarged. Everything had grown more complex. The inner nature of things about which she was troubling for the first time was full of deep and mysterious meaning. This state of mind did not make for happiness, as Mame soon discovered. For one thing, it was out of harmony with the mentality of a practical go-getter. But as she expressed the phenomenon to herself, that old house had put one over on her. It was absurd that a mere inanimate collection of sticks and stones should have the power to do anything of the kind, yet it was not a bit of use shirking the fact that it had done so. There were two Mame Durrances now. Perhaps there always had been, but the one the old house in Shropshire had evoked had lain dormant, and now that it was aroused, it promised to become a mighty inconvenient yokefellow. Hitherto it had been the go-getter who had held command of the ship, a common, sensible, up-and-coming, 2 and 2 makes 4 sort of unit, who saw its duty a dead sure thing and went and did it. But the sleeper, whom one wake of Shropshire had awakened, was a very different kind of bird. No doubt the new and tiresome entity that had sprung to birth was what the world meant by an idealist. It appeared to judge by another standard. There were the things you could do and the things you couldn't do. The business part of Mame knew nothing of this. It only did the things it wanted to do. A week of the Dower House had rather handed a haymaker to Mame's utilitarian world. To such an extent had it mixed its values that she did not quite know where she stood in it. Yet amid the chaos she retained, in a high degree, her natural clearness of vision. It was nearing the dinner hour when Mame's taxi deposited her and her neat luggage at 16B Half Moon Street. Lady Violet, wearing her smartest evening frock, was on the point of going out. She greeted Mame with the air of bright cheerfulness that never seemed to desert her. But the returned traveler had only to glance at the eyes of her friend to learn that she was not feeling so very bright, or so very cheerful. She surprised that look of never say die she had seen in the eyes of Lady Kidderminster. It was impossible not to respect the pluck of these women. "Had a good time?" "Yes." Mame's answer was a trifle dubious, even if she did her best not to make it so. "What did you think of the Towers?" "Bully!" said Mame. And then she asked, less out of a sense of duty than from a desire to change the subject, "How's the work been getting on?" "Gertie Smith is splendid. She's such a worker." Lady Violet sighed humorously. "Oh, how I hate work!" Mame fully believed her. Girls of her special type must long ago have overlaid the habit. The conviction in Celamene's voice did not lessen Mame's respect for her. She had real grit, this girl, to be able to buckle to in the way she did. "There's a letter for you from New York." Lady Violet pointed to the table. "I hope there's no complaint of the firm. We've not been sending many bonnes bouches in the way of news lately." "No, we haven't," agreed Mame, as she opened the letter. It merely contained the monthly check. "That'll come in very useful." "I'll say yes, honey," was Mame's comment to herself. Lady Violet then went off. She was dining with the Childwicks and going on with them to Covent Garden to the Russian ballet, and so did not expect to be home till rather late. Mame was left to a lonely meal round the corner at the Ladies' Imperium. She had made a certain number of friends there, but she was not in a mood for promiscuous conversation, therefore she returned to an early bed. She was very tired, bodily and mentally, but she had a restless and wakeful night. The go-getter and the idealist seemed to be quarreling like fury all through the small hours. If there just wasn't the money to keep things going, and she really cared for Bill, wasn't it her duty to stand aside? "Never heard such bunkum in my life," said the go-getter. "Depends on how much you care for the boy," said the idealist. The go-getter snorted. "You may snort," said the idealist, "but that's the case as I see it." End of chapter 46. Read by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona. June 7, 2024.
Chapter 47 of There Is a Tide. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There Is a Tide by Jessie Snaith. Section 47. They had arranged to meet in the park the next morning at 11. Bill was at the tryst, looking a picture of health, with the genial sun of St. Martin's summer upon him. He really was good to gaze at. Most girls would have thought so, anyway. There he was in his smart morning suit, bright as a new pin, and as gaily amusing as ever. He might not have had a care in the world. Indeed, as he greeted Mame with a flourish of hat and cane, it was hard to believe that he could have. A week's absence had, if anything, endeared them to each other. Mame felt immensely proud of Bill as she came upon him by the railings of the Row, where he stood watching its numerous and decidedly miscellaneous collection of riders. Yes, he was a picture. As Mame beheld him, her mind went rather inconveniently back to the portrait of the third Marquess, under which she had sat in that wonderful room at the Towers. "Good to see you, Puss." Low the voice, and so beguiling. There was a tremendous fascination in this young man. They moved up towards Alexandra Gate and found two lonely chairs among the trees. "And now for a good old powwow." He began to write her name on the grass with the tip of his cane. "You're looking just a wee bit chippy, aren't you? Air of Shropshire takes some digesting, eh? My mother is a clinker, isn't she? And Cousin Mildred. But their young lives are not exactly a bean-fest, what? And then the friends and neighbors. Did you meet the friends and neighbors? Bushels." At the look on Mame's shrewd and piquant countenance, Bill cried, "What ho!" in a fashion which startled a number of sparrows into sitting up and taking notice. "Then that funny old Dower House. I expected rather gave you the pip." As a matter of fact, the Dower House had rather given Mame the pip, but it hardly seemed good manners to do so. "Own up, honest Injun." Bill coolly surveyed the expressive countenance of Mame. "It always does me. But tell me now, what do you think of the Towers? That's a bit of a landmark, isn't it?" "Bully," was Mame's formula for the Towers. It didn't quite express her feelings, but it seemed wise to keep to that inclusive simplicity. "That's the word," Bill agreed. Suddenly Mame took him up. "Bully isn't at all the word for a place like the Towers." To her own ear, her voice grew harsh and strident. "It wants a better word than that. Doesn't carry the meaning, that word. There's an atmosphere about that place, and it gets you." "Hadn't occurred to me." "No?" Mame looked at him sideways. She was a shade incredulous. "If I owned all that just by right of birth, I'd see that nobody ever took it from me." "Rather depend on your bank book, wouldn't it?" Somehow Bill's casualness was almost like a blow. "You see, the trouble with us, as a family, is that we haven't a bob." Mame was fully informed of that. But why not get around and collect a few? She put the question frankly. To Bill, however, it had the merit of being new. It had simply never occurred to him. "Why not?" In Mame's voice was a certain sternness. "Haven't the savvy, for one thing." Bill spoke lightly and easily. "Enormous brains you must have these days to hustle around. Vi is the only one of us with any mind at all. If she had been a man, I believe she might have kept the Towers going. But it would have needed doing, you know. That place swallows money. Not a penny less than 10,000 a year would have been a bit of use." "I'll say not. But isn't it worthwhile, don't you think, to take off your coat and go around and See if you can raise it." Bill began to whistle merrily. His sense of humor was sharply touched. "See me raising 10,000 a year with this old think-box? I'm the utterest ass that ever happened. Why, I can't even tot up a row of figures. I guess I'd learn. If my folks had had the towers for 500 years, do you suppose I'd let people like the Childwicks come along and take it off me? No, I guess you wouldn't." Bill gazed in admiration at the determined face. "Well, what are you going to do about it?" To that forcible question, Bill seemed quite unable to find an answer. Mame did not disguise that an answer was called for. "Your mummer says that if you marry me, you'll have to quit the Pinks." "I know she does." "And that you'll lose the towers." Bill owned ruefully that he knew that, too. "Doesn't it worry you any?" Bill was silent a moment, then shook his head and said cheerfully, "No." "Well, it worries me. I'll tell the world." He frowned a little. Something in the nature of a cloud passed over his sunny mind. Mame this morning hardly seemed to be quite so entertaining as usual. "Why worry," he said, "over things one can't help?" It was Mame's turn to be silent. The frown that gathered about her honest face was more portentous than the one upon Bill's. "Things have got to be helped, it seems to me." She spoke slowly. It was as if the words tore her lips. "I don't quite see how at the moment. There's just one way. I've been thinking it out. We mustn't marry." The serious depth of Mame's tone added detonating power to this thunderbolt. "But that's ridiculous." Bill was no longer casual. "As I figure it out, it'll be more ridiculous if we do. My dear girl, we shall be able to rub along. There'll be a certain amount of money, even if the towers does go, and even if I have to leave the army." Mame shook a stern little head. She certainly was not as amusing this morning as usual. "Not if you keep your engagement with Gwendolen Childwick." "I've never been engaged to Gwendolen Childwick," he indignantly broke in. "Vi says you are as good as engaged to her, and so does your mother. These meddlesome women." Bill spoke vexedly. "I see what it is. You've been letting 'em put the wind up." A flush of crimson showed this to be a palpable hit. "I give you my word there's been no engagement between Gwendolen and me," Bill earnestly added. She knew there had not been, but it did not alter her view that if he was as sensible as he ought to be, there would be an engagement between them soon. "Somebody's been getting at you." He was rather startled by the turn affairs were taking. "You're not yourself this morning. Tell me, Puss, don't you care for me any more?" He looked into her troubled face with an anxiety which made her feel that she wanted to cry. In fact, she had to bite her lip pretty hard to save herself from exposing a most regrettable weakness. "It's because I care for you so much that I can't let you make a fool of yourself." The quaint voice trembled oddly. "If you marry me, it's ruin, and that's all there is to it." He took a little white-gloved paw — she was looking most charmingly spick and span this morning — into his great brown fist. "Rot! A promise is a promise. I won't give you up." "Don't be a fool." Pain, sheer and exquisite, drove her to speak bluntly and harshly. "I'll be a cuckoo in the nest. I don't belong. I won't amuse you always. And then you'd be sorry about the towers, and you'd curse yourself for quitting the army." "I'll risk all that." Mame had a struggle to keep her lips stiff, but she had enough will to say, "There's other folks to think of, you see." "Rot! Why let 'em come spoiling the sport?" "I'd be spoiling the sport. You and Gwendolen were getting on like a house on fire, till I came by." What's come over you?" This was pure Quixotism. Slow in the uptake as he was, he knew how she hated Gwendolen. "You don't know what a friend Vi has been to me. I owe just everything to her. If I butted in and spoiled it all, I'd never be able to look her in the face again. Then there's your mummer. She's been so sweet to me, I just hate to go back on her." Bill had to own that such feelings did Mame real credit, but her attitude seemed to puzzle him a goodish bit. It was rather beyond the order of nature. "You're the nicest and best girl I've met." He was dogged, defiant. "And I mean to hold on to you for all I'm worth." Mame was horribly near tears, yet she still contrived to keep them in check. It was the bitterest moment life so far had given her. But this thing had to be. End of Chapter 47. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 48 of There Is a Tide. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There Is a Tide by J.C. Snaith. Section 48. After a painful hour, they parted and went their ways. Bill, in dudgeon, back to barracks. Mame, with a heartache, to Half Moon Street. All the way up Piccadilly, she was accompanied by two voices. "Mame Durrance, you are a blame fool," said one. "Stick it, girl," said the other. "You're throwing away the chance of your life," said the go-getter. "If you really care for the boy, you just can't marry him," said the idealist. Never had she felt so miserable as when she let herself into the flat. Luckily, Violet was not there. She was able to relieve her overwrought feelings with a little private howl. Then she felt better. In fact, she was able to sit down and compose a few halting lines to Bill, embodying her final decision and giving her reasons for it. That achieved, she went to her bedroom and fetched the engagement ring which 10 days ago had given her such joy. "I must have been cuckoo to have accepted it." "Not half so cuckoo as you are now, you silly elf." Miserably, she packed it in its neat box and was in the act of enclosing the farewell letter when Violet came in. She had been taking the air. One glance Violet gave to the red and swollen lids and the face of tragedy. "Why, my dear, dear child." The vein of kindness in her was deep and true. Those piteous eyes, that piteous mouth, very surely roused it. Don't tell me. A naughty, dangerous little witch. But she was genuinely distressed to see Mame suffer. Something must have hurt her rather horribly. "Tell me, what is it?" "I've let some of you folks put one over on me." Mame fiercely brushed aside new tears. It was not a moment for a smile, yet it was hard to resist one at that whimsical and quaint defiance. Even in the hour of desolation, the minx was like no one else. She had an odd power of attraction. It was by no means easy to dislike her. After all, she had only acted in strict accordance with her nature. "What is it? Tell me." Mame suddenly handed Celimene the letter she had written. You are sending back the ring?" There was a note in the voice of Bill's sister which suggested that it feared to be other than incredulous. You are breaking off the engagement?" "I'll say yes." Perhaps for the first time in their intercourse, real emotion flooded the face of the more accomplished woman of the world. "Dear child," she said softly, and then abruptly turning aside as the bleak face of Mame became more than she could bear. You make one feel indescribably mean." It was perfectly true. She undoubtedly did. the little go-getter. Under all the surface crudity, which month by month was ceasing to be anything like as crude as it had been, was something big, vital, true. Lady Violet was not given to self-deprecation. She knew her power of displacement only too well, even in the queer muss of a modern world. She might have been tempted to laugh at this rather pathetic thing. She might have played her off successfully against certain pretentious people, yet somehow the minx was riding off with all the honors. Mame already had taught her a pretty sharp lesson. It was one she would never forget. Lady Violet, for the future, would always remember that the player of unlawful games must keep an eye on the policeman. And now Mame was teaching her something else. Seldom had this woman of the world found herself quite so much at a loss. Face to face with Mame's heroism, for her self-sacrifice amounted to that. Mere words became an impertinence. The thing to strike her about this good child, when she set eyes on her first, was the extraordinary grit that was in her, and it was that quality which spoke to her now. Abruptly she forced a laugh to keep herself from tears. "My dear, you make one feel like 30 cents. It was one of the choicest phrases of the little go-getter, one among the many that had appealed to her friend. Somehow that phrase seemed to save the situation, yet not altogether. "I guess you don't, honey," Mame said bitterly, "and I guess you never will. You and your mamma and the friends and neighbors and that old house will see to that. I'm the one to feel like 30 cents. The voice was so desolate that even Lady Violet, who did not care much for the practice, could not forbear from giving her a kiss. "I remember your saying that you had come over to pull the big stuff. Well, I rather think you've pulled it." And her friend laughed again, to keep her courage up. "I didn't come to pull this sort of stuff," Mame snorted, as she brushed her eyes fiercely. "I've gone cuckoo, and tomorrow I'll think so. One has to go cuckoo, as you call it, hasn't one, to do the things worth doing? I could no more have let go that foolish bird, had I been you, than I could have jumped over the moon. No, I guess not. And even now, if you don't want to lose him, you had better watch the cage. How can we help you to keep your little paws off the foolish creature?" "By not letting me see him again." Mame was stoical. As she spoke, she wrapped up the box containing the ring and the letter she had written in a piece of brown paper, and then applied red sealing wax. "And if you are wise, you'll just see that he gets married pretty soon to... Even her bravery was not quite equal to the task of pronouncing the hated name. "I think I'll go to the post office and send this back in a registered parcel." She quitted the room abruptly, leaving her friend to some very sharp-edged thoughts. End of Chapter 48. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 49 of There Is a Tide. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There Is a Tide by Jessie Snaith. Section 49. The days that followed were dark and difficult for Mame, nor did Lady Violet find them particularly easy. At heart she was kindly and honest, and she could not help fixing upon herself a good deal of the blame for what had occurred. She it was who had introduced this little marauder. She had been wilfully and stupidly blind to the consequences, and her only excuse was that not for a moment could she believe that Bill would be so weak. Yet she had deliberately thrown them together. She had bestowed upon Mame a spurious eligibility. This bitterly humiliating business was an object lesson in the sheer folly of playing the fool. It was decidedly painful all around. First of all, poor Mame really suffered. The part she had undertaken to play was superhumanly big. Very few girls could have gone back in that way on their whole philosophy of life, and to Violet's good heart it was hateful to have to ask her to do it. She must have loved Bill, perhaps as no other woman was likely to do. To nerve herself to a sacrifice so high. Much diplomacy was called for in the days that followed. Bill could be a stubborn fellow. His family had always humored his whims. It looked at first as if there would be no handling him. Irresponsible, not to say flabby, as his nature was, had he had the wit to realize clearly that poor Mame had got a blow over the heart, he would not have taken the thing lying down. Violet, hating intensely the role her own folly had doomed her to play, yet proved herself, when fairly put to it, a consummate tactician. Bill must not guess, must not come near guessing, how much this good and brave child really cared for him. He must be rather a dud, his sister thought, not to see it for himself. Instinct ought to have told him how the little brick was stealing her heart. Even while Violet threw dust in his eyes with a subtlety and a success for which she loathed herself, she yet clung to the paradoxical view that had Bill been worthy of Mame, he would have been less obtuse. "She can't bear your losing the Towers and giving up the army." That phrase was Violet's strongest weapon. It admitted two interpretations, and his sister was not in the least proud of Bill when he allowed it to suggest the wrong one. Of course she considers the guilt will be off the gingerbread. That was Machiavellian. The end seemed to justify the means. At any rate, Violet was so persuaded herself, but it really was rather low down, and she could not, womanlike, help resenting Bill's denseness and lack of character, which made the unpleasant task of throwing dust in his eyes so much less difficult than it ought to have been. The weeks went by, and Mame set herself stoically to forget. There was pride in her as well as grit. She was determined to stand up to life and make something of the mighty difficult business of living it. To staunch her wounds, she threw herself into her work with new ardor. Back of everything was rare common sense. She must have the strength to bear the self-inflicted blow without flinching. One morning, however, just before Christmas, an incident occurred that reopened the closing wounds. Mame and Celimene were discussing the make-up of the weekly cable to New York, when Celimene said with an odd change of tone, "There's one bit of news that may not be without interest on the other side. It's not yet announced, so we shall be the first in the field." "What is the news?" asked Mame keenly. Her flair for a choice tidbit was not less than of yore. "A marriage has been arranged, the date of which will be shortly announced, between the Marquis of Kidderminster and Gwendolen, the only child of Giles Childwick, Esquire, and Mrs. Childwick, formerly of Treville, New Jersey." "Oh!" Mame gave a little gasp. Celimene saw her turn very white. "We are none of us worthy of you, my dear. In the end you'll find yourself well rid of people like us." Violet's tone had a note of pain that for her was something new. Life had not been exactly a bed of roses lately. She had discovered, a little late in the day perhaps, that she had a conscience. A share of the hurt she was inflicting had to be borne by herself. When Mame was able to speak, she said, "You have been good enough for me. I like you all. You are some of the nicest folks I've met." The whimsical frankness of this good child brought back the laugh, if not too readily, to the worldly wise Violet. What a piece of luck! They both had a sense of humor. We owe you more than perhaps you realize. Violet did not find the words easy, but they had to be said. You showed how terribly dangerous was delay, as far as that brother of mine is concerned. He might have been snapped up by some pretty little prowler, with a nice taste in dicky birds, who, short of death and destruction, could never have been persuaded to unclasp her claws. That's so, assented Mame, and you're wise to have hustled on that marriage. And then whimsically, to ease the aching of her heart, some other little cat might have got that bird. She was so real and so true, this brave child, that Violet felt she would like to have taken her in her arms and hugged her. My mother and I both realize that you have done a big thing. She has sent you all sorts of kind messages. We are going to see that Gwendolen plays the game so far as you are concerned. And no matter how long you stay over here, you will always have friends. Gwendolen will make him a good wife. Yes, she will. She's a very sensible girl, with a strong will. I am sure she will keep him on the rails. And she really cares for him. Perhaps he'll get to care for her after a while. I think he may. Gwendolen is a very good sort. But I'm afraid Bill's feelings don't run deep. And the note of pain crept again into the voice of his sister. End of Chapter 49. Recording by John Brandon.
Chapter 50 of There Is a Tide. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There Is a Tide by Jessie Snaith. The marriage ceremony was fixed for the second week of the new year. All London was invited. The Childwicks liked to do things well, and, however well they did them, made no impact on their wealth. They were really rich people, and of late years their stock had been going continually up. Still, it was generally felt that Gwendolen had done very well. She was a cut and polished jewel, but a setting was needed for her. What choicer setting could mortal girl desire than an old and distinguished marquisate, and that beautiful and historical place, Warlington Towers? These things would supply the essential background her millions lacked. Then, too, Bill was a popular young man. His feelings, as his sister said, might not run deep, but in his way he was immensely attractive. Everybody liked Bill. Even his fecklessness was a point in his favor, and he would be all the better for having a shrewd and clever American wife to keep him up to the mark. Mame received an invitation from the Childwicks. Her friends saw to that. It was duly accepted, yet when the day came she did not feel equal to facing the music. Lady Violet did her best to persuade her to come to the church and to the reception in Berkeley Square, until she realized that it would not be kind to persist. Good, brave little puss! Those quaint furry paws had been rather nastily trapped. She was still suffering. For all her wonderful grit, when the day came she could not help groaning a bit over the throbbing of her wounds. It went to Lady Violet's heart to leave her behind, but there was no help for it, and the child could not face the music, and it was hardly reasonable to expect that she should. Even as Lady Violet stood in her regalia, which emphasized her fine points, and took a tender and affectionate leave of poor Mame, she could not help saying in her frank way, "I'm not going to enjoy this one bit. We're shown up too badly. I wish now I hadn't interfered." It was no more than the truth. She felt on a low plane. Compared with her friend and business partner, she had a sense of inferiority which was new and decidedly unwelcome. "You were quite right, Annie." Mame was brave and magnanimous to the end. "Had I been you, I'd just have done that. It's nature, and it's no use trying to go against nature." But Mame's eyes were so tragic that her friend, without venturing to say another word, made a sort of bolt for the door and for the lift beyond it. No, Lady Violet did not feel that she was going to enjoy her day. The day, for Mame, was very far from being one of enjoyment either. A great deal of it was spent walking about London. Now the pinch had really come, it was the go-getter who mounted to the saddle and took command. The practical side of a dual nature was not slow to inform her that she had gone back on herself. She had betrayed, at the beck of a mere whim, all that she had stood for. Life had always been against her until a few months ago. She had had to fight so hard for bare existence that she might at least have had the sense to ensure the future when opportunity arose. But no, she had denied her luck. There was a tide. Well, the tide had come and she had deliberately ignored it. A great position, Social Security, had been offered her. She had even accepted her chance and then, just for whim, had passed it on to her enemy and rival. The go-getter spared her nothing. It had a royal time. She had been a fool. The lot of the fool was suffering. You've broken a paw, honey. Always you'll be a little mucker now. You'll never be able to fix on anything again. No more will you be able to mark down your bird and fly at it. You'll be unsettled for the rest of your days. Not always will you be brisk and quick. Your looks, such as they are, and they've never been much to bank on, honey, are going already. These folks in London, England, who mocked at you and pulled your leg, you could have handed them a haymaker. But no, you must get fanciful and highfalutin. Yes, the go-getter with a sardonic voice and a flow of rather second-rate conversation had a royal time. He spared her nothing. She was unworthy of herself, of her breed, of her clan. Idealism. The hardy fellow landed a simp of a partner, a blow on the point. If some of these honest-to-God Americans didn't watch out, idealism was going to be their ruin. You didn't catch the dyed-in-the-wool Britisher playing around with flams of that kind. He was a pretty successful merchant, the Britisher, but he was content to leave idealism to other people. As a businessman, he was a model for the world. And why? Because, with all his lip service, he knew how to keep the soft stuff apart from the hard. Poor Mame! She trudged half the day about the streets of a hostile city. With that pressure upon her spirit, it was impossible to stay quiet indoors. Her very soul seemed to ache. Every syllable was true that was whispered in her overwrought ear. She had gone back on all she had ever stood for. They had put one over on her, these hard-road Britishers. Yes, she must be cuckoo. You came over to pull big stuff, whispered the relentless voice. And by cripes, Mame Durrance, you've pulled it. Tired out at last with tramping the West End parks and squares, she took a little food in a restaurant in a by-street of Soho. There she was likely to meet no one she knew. She was not in a mood to face her kind. As she ate her soup, a nostalgia came upon her. After all, she was in a strange land, an alien. Their ways were not her ways. They had a different viewpoint. Their method of doing things was not the same. She began to long for the sight and the sound of the homely, hearty, warm-blooded folks she had known, the folks who spoke the same language as herself, in the curious drawl that lately she had been taking such pains to get rid of. Her thoughts went back to the land where she belonged. In the bitterest hour she had known since she had started out from her hometown to see life, she had a craving for the friendly easy-goingness of her own kind. She had crowded a lot of experience into her European pilgrimage. In certain ways her luck had been truly remarkable. Mame Durrance had made good at her job, but this evening, with a very large-sized black monkey upon her, she had a sudden yearning for the larger and freer air of her native continent. Miserably unhappy, she returned to the flat about 9 o'clock. Lady Violet had been home from the revels, had inquired for her anxiously, but had changed her dress and gone out to dinner. Evidently she was making a day of it. Mame was not sorry. She had no wish to be caught in this mood. Yet she had no desire for bed. She would not be able to sleep if she turned in. The ache in her heart was terrible. If she could not learn to subdue it, for the first time in her life, she would be driven to take a drug. Suddenly, her eye lit on a package on the writing table. It bore the label of a New York publisher and was addressed to herself. Perfunctorily, She tore off the wrapper. A novel in a gay jacket was revealed. It was called Prairie City, and the name of the author was Elmer Pell Dobree. Mame's heart leaped. Coincidence has an arm notoriously long, but nothing could have been more timely than the arrival of this book. Her thoughts rushed back to the source of its being, and, as if to speed them on their way, a letter had been enclosed in the parcel. Characteristically, it ran: Dear Mame, you are such a girl now among your slick friends in London, and you are pulling such big stuff with your weekly columnizing, that I dare say you have forgotten your obscure Cowbarn epic, and the junk whose early chapters you had the honor of typing for your first and most distinguished editor, with which the boo filled in his spare hours. You used to tell him how good these opening chapters were, and the boob used to believe you. The consequence is... Well, this is the consequence. By the way, it was clever you that invented the title, after we had shaken a leg, and you were always some dancer, at that dive at the top of 2nd Street one wet afternoon. Well, Mame, that title was lucky. Prairie City has made good. It has, if I may say it modestly, made quite surprisingly good. 'Tis hardly 6 weeks since it was first issued here by Allardyce, Inc., but already it's gone big. Early next month their London house will publish it, and if it can repeat in England what it has done in New York, the undersigned Elmer Pell Dobree is a permanent whale. So go to it, Mame, you little go-getter. Corral the big drum and get around the comic town of your adoption, worse luck, and see if, for the sake of old times, good times there were too, I'll tell the world, you can't put one over in the name of an old friend on the doggone Britisher. P.S. When do we see you again here? As I've told you more than once, this continent is a poor place for your absence. If you've left us for keeps, it's a great, great shame, and there's one young man who won't forgive you. When, at a decidedly late hour, or rather an early one, Lady Violet returned from the festivities, she invaded Mame's bedroom. She wanted to see if the child had come back, and that she was all right. In spite of the excitements of the day, her thoughts had been pretty constantly with her little friend. She was a good deal concerned about Mame, and now it was something of a relief to find her propped up in bed, simply devouring a book with a red cover. It was so good to see a smile on a countenance which, a few hours ago, looked as if it would never smile again, that the intruder exclaimed, Why, whatever have you there? Elmer's written a book. A glow of excitement was in Mame's tone and in her eyes. It's all about Cowbarn and the folks who we used to know. True to life, I hope. Mame's friend, gazing at her furtively, sought to read what lay behind that rather hectic air. Better than life ever was or ever will be. It just gets you feeling good, and it keeps you feeling good all the time. He must be a clever man, your friend Elmer P. Clever is not the name for Elmer. Mame spoke excitedly. A genius! That baby! All the Cowbarn folks are in it. I'm in it, and I'll say he's let me down light. I hope he made you the heroine of the piece. Anyhow, he ought to have. You are fit to be the heroine of the best piece ever written. Say, now, honey, expostulated Mame in the way her friend had learned to love, that's where you get off. Heroinism and that fancy Jake is no use to me. I'll never be able to get away with it, but Elmer has let me down light. You must let me read it. Mame laughed. She actually laughed. Why, you shall so. It's the goods. That boy has an eye to him. He can see into things, and he knows a lot about human nature, does that boy. Already Lady Violet was feeling a lively sense of gratitude towards the famous and legendary Elmer P. The poor child was transformed. Her own people, for whose homely and abounding kindliness she had in her misery been longing, were alive in those magic pages. Yes, they were alive, and they were dancing, Mame declared, and half America was dancing with them. The mirths of the simple creatures she loved so well had lifted a weight from her heart. The relief might only be temporary, but Lady Violet was very willing to do homage to the wizardry of Elmer P. "There's his letter." Mame tossed it excitedly across the bright green expanse of counterpane. Lady Violet read with a smile. And then suddenly there came a mischievous little clutch at her heart. Yes, why not? It was an idea. The brilliantly clever woman of the world again glanced furtively at Mame. The intoxicating moment, which was doing so much to heal the child and to keep her sane, must, if possible, be held. But how? Like all things in time, it was fleeting, transitory. With the coming of daylight, it would surely pass. A pitiless January dawn would throw her back upon hard and cruel reality. Yet this moment of happiness might be extended. Perhaps there was a chance of making it permanent. She fixed her wise eyes upon those of the feverish Mame. "Yes, my dear, we'll go round with the big drum. We'll corral the press all right. If Prairie City doesn't knock London endways, it shall not be our fault." "You can bet your life it won't be." "Well, write tomorrow and tell him so." "I will. And tell him, my dear, in a postscript, strongly underlined, that, if he will do the one thing you ask, you'll guarantee the success of Prairie City this side the Atlantic." Mame was all ears. "What's that, honey?" "He must come over himself as soon as ever he can. We'll promise the very best that can be done for him in the way of a good time. After all, there's no advertisement for a book quite equal to the person who wrote it." Mame gave a chuckle of pleasure. "Sure, it was an idea. Why had not she thought of it herself?" "Yes, hon, if Elmer comes, that'll fix it." But would he come? That stern question at once invaded Mame's mind. "We'll make him," said Lady Violet. "He's not easy to make do anything he don't want to. And he's pretty busy these days, and rather important, too." "We'll get at him somehow." Lady Violet had an arch look. "For his own sweet sake," she added artfully. End of Chapter 50. Read by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona, August 23, 2024. Chapter 51 of There Is a Tide. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There Is a Tide by J.C. Snaith. The next day they laid their clever heads together and wrote a letter to Elmer P. It was appreciative but peremptory. He must mail his latest photograph at once, and he had better send that old green album too, with all those snapshots in it of Cowbarn, Iowa, including some interesting views of the exterior and the interior of the office building of the good old Independent. Mame gave a solemn undertaking to get out the big drum and to go around with it. She and her friends, in fact, would organize such a publicity campaign as would astonish even a booster like himself. But he, too, must be ready to do his bit. By the time London had the book in its hands, it would be dying to see the author. He must come over, if only for a week. He must! He must! That final imperative word was 3 times underscored. The 13 days that followed the letter's posting were rather anxious ones. Lady Violet feared that when Mame's excitement had time to cool, a bad reaction would set in. By judicious fanning, however, she was able to keep the flame alive, sufficiently, at any rate, to provide a highly necessary distraction. Elmer's reply came promptly. The urgent skill of the summons had at least stirred him to that. Moreover, in the pompous language of the British House of Go-Getters, which Mame had heard for herself from the ladies' gallery, the answer was in the affirmative. The great man actually promised to come to London. His coming, moreover, should synchronize with the British publication of his book, which, since he wrote last, had sold 3 more editions in these United States. "He doesn't let the grass grow," Mame crowed her triumph. It was disinterested triumph. She had nothing to gain, as far as she knew, by the coming of Elmer, except in the way of humble-minded ministry to his rapidly growing fame. One of the up-and-coming ones is Elmer, for all he's so quiet. Tell me, Vi, what do you think of his photograph? Is it like him? He's changed some, I'll say, since I left him in the editor's office at Cowbarn 20 months ago tomorrow. A clever face. A good face, too, Lady Violet might have added. She certainly saw something oddly attractive in the fair, open countenance of Elmer P. I guess there's something better than clever in it. Mame gazed critically at the photograph. Well, dear child, I guess there is, too. Her friend looked at her tenderly, and then laughed to herself softly. End of chapter 51, read by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona, June 1, 2024. Chapter 52 of There Is a Tide. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There Is a Tide by Jessie Snaith. They lost no time in getting to work. First, they went to Henrietta Street and called upon Allardyce Inc. Taking wise men into their counsels, they started to plan a campaign whose aim was the making of Elmer Pell Dobree a household name in Britain. They infected Allardyce Inc. with their own enthusiasm. Not, perhaps, such a difficult process. Every mail was bringing news of breaking records across the water. Prairie City was the best in its kind since Mark Twain. Indeed, some of the highbrows thought really and truly it was better. The publishers were taken with Mame. All the natural zip of the booster born sprang to the surface as she lightly gave off her ideas for the big drum. Very bright some of these ideas were. There was one in particular which appealed to these shrewd men. Unfortunately, to carry it out would cost money. But as Miss Amethyst Du Rance, a writer herself, by the way, declared, quoting from a favorite calendar that had once adorned the wall at the back of her typewriter in that identical office which soon would be famous over the breadth of 2 continents, if you want to make omelets, you've got to break eggs. This boom was going to cost money. No use burking that fact in political economy, but it was going to be worth it. Lady Violet Treherne, that very distinguished-looking girl who had accompanied the corking little Miss Durrance into the back parlor, Celine, by the way, of the Morning News, was of that opinion too. Prairie City was the goods. It was the big stuff. Every dime spent on boosting it would earn $1. Allardyce Inc., of the Allardyce Building, East 49th Street, New York City, USA, and 1A Henrietta Street, London, England, not to mention 16 Rue de la Paix, Paris, France, 39 Stratton Street, Johannesburg, South Africa, and 105 Victoria Avenue, Melbourne, Australia. In short, wherever the honest mother tongue is spoken, Allardyce Inc. decided to fall for Miss Durrance and her little campaign. Still, it was going to cost money. It'll be worth it all the time. The air of Miss Durrance was already victorious. You do your bit, and we'll do ours. That's all we ask. The head of the London branch of the well-known firm personally bowed the 2 ladies into their taxi. He had not been so impressed in years. Full of vim, this Miss Durrance. Portentously full of pep. No wonder they made good in cradle-rocking Britain when they came over, these 100% little ladies from the U.S. And the cunning minx kept back a few grains of the pep for her final shot. As she offered a hand in parting, at its most fashionable angle, to Allardyce Inc., she said, in her new and careful Mayfair manner, "When Elmer Pell Dobree arrives in this country, Lady Violet Treherne will give a luncheon for him at the Savoy Hotel. All the most worthwhile folks in London will be invited to meet him. I tell you, sir, although you mustn't tell the world just now, she has already arranged for her friend the Prime Minister, if he happens to be disengaged at the moment, to attend the gathering and to give an address on the value of literary art in international relations." They left Allardyce Inc., balanced on the extreme edge of the curb of Henrietta Street, staring after their departing chariot. As they drove off to luncheon at the Ladies' Imperium, Lady Violet said, "My child, I rather think you clicked." Mame felt rather that she had. The happy feeling was confirmed, moreover, a little later in the week, when a second letter from Elmer P. was delivered in Half Moon Street. In it, that now famous man positively undertook to be at the Savoy Hotel on February 10, always providing the Olympic, in which he had booked a passage, came in on time. He hoped to stay a fortnight in London, but that, he feared, must be his limit, for just now he was living a 48-hour day in New York. "You can bet your life that's so," was Mame's approving comment. End of Chapter 52, read by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona, June 28, 2024. Chapter 53 of There Is a Tide. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There Is a Tide by J.C. Snaith. Elmer came and saw London, England, and the ancient burg gave him a real good time. He went here, there, and everywhere. His photograph was in all the papers. Columns were written about his book. There was a brilliant luncheon at the Savoy. Lady Violet kept her promise. Bigwigs attended it, including her father's old friend, the Prime Minister, who seized the occasion to deliver a most significant address on the value, etc., which was cabled verbatim all over the English-speaking world. No young author, since the art of writing was invented, ever had a more generous reception in the great metropolis. A modest, rather shy young man, he was inclined at first to be overwhelmed by it, but the undefeated Mame, who met him at Euston, who took him to his hotel, who gave him continual advice, saw to it that he wasn't. For the honor of Cowbarn, Iowa, he must stand right up to his job. It was her task to see that he did so without flinching, and she duly performed it. She mothered him through receptions and tea parties, she toted him around, and the bewildered and breathless Elmer hardly knew whether to be more impressed by the storm his coming had aroused, or by the manner in which Mame wrote it. Nothing in the whole of London astonished him quite so much as Mame's transformation from her chrysalis Cowbarn period. Her clothes, her style, her English accent fairly tickled him to death. Then the friends she had made! She appeared to hobnob with half the swells in Britain, and to have them feeding from the hand. Elmer had many surprises in these crowded and glorious days, but, shrewd and cool American citizen that he was, he managed to keep a perfectly level head. For the life of him, he couldn't imagine what all the fuss was about, or at least, if he had an inkling of the reason for it, he could not understand how Mame had contrived it all. She had evidently had the luck to strike some very powerful backers. Even before landing in England, he had surmised that such was the case. The mysterious Celimene, of the weekly newsletter, had proved to be so highly informed in social matters that her value had been clearly demonstrated in New York. Her name had been given him in confidence before he came over, and he was mighty keen to meet her. They might be said to challenge each other's curiosity, but their meeting not only fulfilled their hopes of one another, it was the beginning of a friendship. One could not help liking the author of Prairie City. He was a well-set-up young man, and behind the dry shrewdness and the determination to get there, qualities characteristic of Mame herself, were genuine kindliness and modesty. His rise to fame had been less sudden than it seemed. It had been prepared for and earned. He owned to 31 years of life. They had not been easy years, but they had made him the man he was. Lady Violet was glad that Elmer answered fully to Mame's description of him as a regular fellow. There was something about him that inspired confidence. Whether it was a certain slowness of speech, which implied depth of mind, a vein of real grit, or the charming air of diffidence with which he wore the fame that so deservedly was his, she instinctively felt that here was what Mame called a he-man. This was well. She had a plan in that sagacious mind of hers, but the carrying out of it depended upon Elmer P. himself. Unless he could pass the test, and a pretty severe one, that a thorough woman of the world felt bound to impose, the fine scheme was doomed from the outset. His bearing, however, in those crowded days in which they saw a good deal of each other, convinced this friend that rumor had not overpainted him. Undoubtedly the young man deserved the position his talents had won. Beneath the surface a little stiff and formal at first, and, the critic thought, none the worse for that, was a warmth of heart and a balance of nature which enabled him to pass his examination with flying colors. As much time as Elmer could spare from his exceedingly numerous engagements was devoted to Half Moon Street. From the first afternoon he went there to drink tea with reviewers and people of influence in the world of letters, he took a great liking to the place. For one thing, he was made to feel so much at home. The presence of Mame guaranteed that. She was quite unspoiled, in spite of the English accent, which to Elmer's secret delight was apt to wear a little thin in places. He was no end of an observer, the author of Prairie City. Back in Cowbarn days, there was something in Mame that had appealed to him, and in this new orientation she was still the Mame he had liked, smiled at just a little, and yet admired. Wonderful how she had been able to get away with it. Yet he was not really surprised. He had always known that his little stenographer had a lot in her. Everybody was so friendly in Half Moon Street. They seemed to take quite a personal pride in his success. They seemed to treat it almost as part of their own. During the hours he spent there, Mame and her friend, Lady Violet, were always devising fresh schemes for Prairie City. The boom was growing daily, but it must get bigger and bigger. Had he been their own brother, they could not have done more. One afternoon, when Elmer had been in London a week, he came rather early and happened to catch Lady Violet alone. Mame had gone, at the call of duty, to the premiere of a new play. In this rather providential absence, which yet did not owe quite so much to Providence as appeared on the surface, Lady Violet seized the chance to have a private talk. "So you are leaving us a week today?" Elmer confessed that was his intention. "If you find us all as complacent as our perfectly absurd newspapers, you won't be sorry." Elmer had the tact to ignore the vexed question of the British newspaper. "I'll be sorry enough," he said with simple sincerity. "You are just giving me the time of my life. Your book is so delightful. Every fresh reader is one friend more for the man who has written it." Lady Violet yielded to none in point of tact. Over that course few could live with her. "But I do hope you realize," she went laughingly on, "that, although you are your own best asset, as of course every true author has to be, you have also had a very clever and enthusiastic friend to pull the strings over here." Elmer realized that. "One doesn't say your success might not have been as great without her, but it could hardly have come so soon." Yes, Elmer was sure. "The way that dear child has worked for you has simply been splendid. Had she written the book herself, I don't think she could have been prouder of it. She literally bullied your publishers into boosting you. You know what even the best publishers are. She bullied me into corralling the Prime Minister. It was a rare bit of luck getting him to come and make that speech. And it was her idea, wasn't it, that you should come over here and let us see you?" Elmer felt all this was true, but gallantly he wanted to include Lady Violet herself in the big bill of his gratitude. "Please keep it all for Mame. That good child deserves every bit. She has worked for you like a demon. As good as gold, as true as steel, and she is quite cast down that you are leaving us next week." Unluckily there was no help for it, but Elmer P., like most people of true genius, was simple at heart. He responded to the piping. Mame Durrance. In the mouth of her former employer, the accent fell upon the first syllable of her surname rather than upon the second, deserved all the luck that was in the world. She was as real as they made them, and she was able to think of others. Lady Violet drove that right home. I, of all people, have reason to know it. She is capable of big things, that dear child. Some day, when you come and see us again, as of course you will, I may tell you a little story about her. Elmer could not help feeling a subtle flattery. It is difficult for rising young men to resist such a feeling when they find themselves tête-à-tête with an accomplished woman of the world. Lady Violet was quite as intriguing as any of the Fifth Avenue queens, with one or two of whom he was beginning to get acquainted. Mame had had amazing luck to put herself in so solid with this fascinating woman. It was true that Elmer personally owed a lot to Mame, a peerless little go-getter, but it was also true that Mame, for her part, owed much to this brilliant daughter of a famous statesman who, in his day, had done a great deal for the English-speaking world. The clock ticked pleasantly on till 5 o'clock, and then quite as pleasantly to 5:15. But no Mame. Lady Violet feigned surprise. Then she glanced at an imposing array of cards on the chimney-piece. Oh, yes, she remembered. This was the at-home day of the wife of an influential editor. Mame had evidently kept it in mind, even if Lady Violet herself had forgotten. "She's gone there to boost Prairie City," said her friend with a smile. "Wherever she goes now, she boosts Prairie City, and at night she boosts it in her dreams." 5:15 already! Elmer D'Aubry rose with a start. At 5:30, Lady Violet must really excuse him. He was due in Aldwych to orate the journalist circle on the coming of the American novel. He was sorry to go, but Mame had fixed that on him at about 12 hours' notice, and, as his good fairy declared, it would mean another edition. He supposed he must stand up, a hero, and face it. "You must!" Lady Violet had what Elmer privately described as a Gioconda smile. Here was guile, here was subtlety, or the author of Prairie City was not a judge of such matters. How intriguing she was! Gee, she had a power of making your blood course quicker. "I've one favor to ask, Lady Violet." Elmer was moving to the door. "Can you and Mame spare tomorrow evening to dine with me quietly at the Savoy?" Lady Violet took up a little red book from the writing table. A glance revealed that, by the courtesy of Providence, tomorrow night was free. She could not answer for Mame, but to the best of her recollection, there was reason to think the little go-getter would not be in action that evening. So then it was arranged, a little dinner, just the three of them, for the next evening, which was so providentially free, at the convenient hour of 8. Unless, of course, Mame, which somehow Lady Violet felt was hardly likely, telephoned him to the contrary. End of Chapter 53, read by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona, August 1, 2024. Chapter 54 of There Is a Tide. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There Is a Tide by J.C. Snaith. The little dinner was capital. In every small but considered detail, it could not have been nicer. Elmer P., as the world looks for in one of his eminence, was growing to be a judge of food and wine. Also, the shrewd dog knew how to choose his company. On his right sat Lady Violet. On his left was Mame. Over and beyond this pair of friends and boosters was vacancy, the limitless inane, at least so far as those three minds were concerned, although at other tables sat persons not without importance in their way. In return for delicate food and dry champagne, Elmer received high entertainment from the lively tongues of his charming guests. Both were observers of the human comedy, yet they observed it in the right way. There was nothing in their talk that was spiteful or backstairs, or beneath the dignity of human nature. Their aptness, wit, and general information, their opinions upon books, plays, music, and the world at large, gave the host a mental punch from the hors d'oeuvres to the commis pere and the crème de menthe, for which crude liqueur both ladies confessed a partiality. Elmer had had his triumphs, in the last week or so particularly, but frankly he doubted whether he had ever enjoyed a meal like this. It was so gay, and there was a glamour of new experience. His life had suddenly been touched to newer and finer issues. When the coffee appeared at the end of the meal, Lady Violet drank hers quickly. Then, quite unexpectedly, she rose. She would have to fly. There was a musical party she had promised to attend. A stupid affair, but it was a call of duty. Mame and Elmer were pressing in their entreaties for their amusing friend to remain, but she was not to be seduced from the true path. Besides, as she laughingly said, it was a perfect night of stars. And this being a sufficiently rare occurrence for London, she hoped that Elmer, if she might use his Christian name, would walk with Mame through Trafalgar Square, along Pall Mall, up the Haymarket, across the Circus, and down the full length of Piccadilly. She ventured to prescribe that route, because a little bird had whispered that if Elmer duly followed it, he might look for a very pleasant surprise, for which Mame alone was responsible. This was all so enigmatic that Elmer might have been tempted to disbelieve Lady Violet, but he knew she was no trifler. Emphatically, she was one of the people who did not make promises unless they were able to deliver the goods. "We'll go along and try it anyway," conceded Elmer the polite, and being something of an altruist into the bargain. "But you'll come with us, won't you? We can't lose you." Lady Violet's refusal was amusingly definite. She was late already. She must fly. Besides, there was an even more cogent reason. That, however, she was careful not to disclose to Elmer P. Debris. As that homme du monde moved a bit ahead of her to the restaurant door to see her into her cloak and her taxi, she bent to Mame's ear and whispered urgently, "My child, if you don't put one over on him tonight, I'll never speak to you again." End of chapter 54, read by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona, July 23, 2024. Chapter 55 of There Is a Tide. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There Is a Tide by Jessie Snaith. A blithe 20 minutes or so after Lady Violet had flown, Elmer and Mame decided to get a move on. For one thing, Elmer's curiosity had been tremendously piqued by the surprise that had been predicted. What could it be? Lady Violet, he supposed, was just pulling his leg. Yet he didn't think so, really. He knew she was not the kind of person to break a solemn promise. Still, there was nothing to deduce from the attitude of Mame. The aider and abettor of Lady Violet was giving nothing away. The stars were very bright, the air, for the time of year, quite balmy. The pavements of London were dry as a bone. All the conditions, therefore, were favourable for outdoor exercise. Indeed, as Elmer said, or it may have been Mame who said it, the evening was just ideal for the purpose. Mame put on her lovely new cloak trimmed with fur, or at least Elmer put it on for her. Then Elmer got into his overcoat and clapped on his smart gibus, which gave him such a look of distinction that a loafer, caging for pence just beyond the courtyard of the hotel, promptly addressed him as Captain. The mutt got the coppers all right. It was not so much that Elmer was susceptible to that kind of flattery, as that, just now, he was not in a mood to refuse anything to anybody. He was moving about this evening in an enchanted world. At every step they took in it now, the world through which they were moving seemed to grow more entrancing. For one thing, there was a powerful magic in the stars. The strip of moon, too, as Mame remarked, seemed to be trying to put one over on them. She made this observation while they were in the act of steering each other across the perilous vortex, from Northumberland Avenue to Morley's Hotel, and nearly barging into more than one of their compatriots in the process. However, they crossed in safety. Then they crossed again by the National Gallery, and sauntered gaily along until they came to that great landmark in Mame's adventurous life, the Carlton Hotel. She gave a long look at it as they went by. Even on this night of marvels, she could not pass that consecrated spot without a sense of amazement and gratitude. They turned up by the Haymarket according to plan, and then slowly rounded the corner into Piccadilly Circus. And then it was, in this identical moment, that the goods were delivered, in the most unexpected and convincing way. The surprise that had been solemnly promised Elmer appeared right before his eyes. A flaming electric sign winked letter by letter from the starlit sky. Prairie City, by Elmer Pell Dobree. The book all the world is reading. Gee! Gasped Elmer. The secret had been carefully kept. He had not an inkling. A surprise, indeed. A masterpiece of boosting. Mame's voice rose in triumph. Say, listen, Elmer. I'll tell the world this is where we put one over on London, England. Down Piccadilly they walked on air. No word passed. But to keep in touch with himself and the mundane realities, Elmer took Mame's hand. These were sublime moments. Suddenly, high above the famous street, the sign flamed out again. Say, listen, Mame, began Elmer hoarsely. But even with all his genius to help him, he did not know how to end, so he merely squeezed her hand. The dear little go-getter! How slick she was! But she was also something much better than slick. She was fine and true. A minute they stood gazing at the recurring sign in all its brilliancy, and then, life being too wonderful to stand still in it, they moved on hand in hand. Sure it was destiny they should be walking thus, 4,000 miles, 4,000 solid miles, from the dear funny old spot in which they had walked last. If only Cowbarn, Iowa, could see that sign. The book all the world was reading. The book that had immortalized the folks. Would they recognize themselves in all their humor and their quiddity? When speech was possible between them, which was not until they were near the precincts of the Ritz, it was Mame who dared. Elmer, her voice was very soft, I'm feeling pretty good about our book. She said our book. There's not one word we'll ever have to wish away. The folks aren't saints, the folks aren't, but there ain't a line that's mean. There's nothing to make 'em sorry. Some of the stories you might have told, you didn't tell. Some of the things you might have said, you didn't say. Elmer, I'm feeling pretty good about that book. Elmer, too, was feeling pretty good. In fact, so good was Elmer feeling that for all he was fully launched in the realms of letters, he still couldn't find a word. Not one word. But like all young men of force and originality, he enjoyed a certain power of action. Quite suddenly, without premeditation, he put one over on Mame. In the dark shadow cast by the Ritz arcade, he kissed the little go-getter. Mame was thrilled by the sheer audacity of the assault, but there was the authority of the book all the world was reading, that the heart of women is a queer thing, so she just didn't mind at all. However, she did not speak again until, hand in hand, they had convoyed each other past a line of pirates in the guise of taxi-cabmen, whom the law allows to range themselves in a row opposite Devonshire House. Nay, she didn't speak until they had passed the end of Half Moon Street, the other side of the road, and on by the railings of Green Park. It was when they halted to gaze at the bright windows of the Ladies' Imperium that Mame's soft voice was heard. That's the hen club I belong to. Elmer was impressed. It's the chicest hen club in London. Elmer guessed it was. Cocks are not admitted. If they was, Mame said was, yet she knew perfectly well it wasn't grammar. I'd take you right in and buy you a cocktail. This was a little too much for the author of Prairie City. Such un-American play upon words was the palpable fruit of mental stress, but in combination with the magic of the stars, it was a little too much for Elmer P. Dobree. Now then, Mame Durrance, can that? And then immediately opposite those flaming windows, and in the lee of the park railings which hid them well, he kissed her again with rapturous violence. After this stimulating episode, they moved slowly along by the Green Park. They still walked hand in hand. Even now it didn't seem safe to let go of each other. But when they came to the quadriga, that symbol of victory, significantly poised on the top of the park gates, which is much and justly admired, they stopped and gazed up. They gazed up at the quadriga by the royal light of the stars. Their hands were locked in each other's. The eternal verities caught them suddenly. Mighty, mighty forces were flowing through and over, this brief and transient, this pitifully brief and transient life of man. "Elmer!" It was Mame's voice, but hardly more than a whisper. It was so solemn and so hushed. "Imagine, Elmer, you and me—" But Elmer said nothing. With a queer tightening of the breast, he continued to gaze upwards to the symbol of victory on the top of the park gates. End of chapter 55. Read by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona, August 5, 2024. End of There is a Tide by J.C. Snaith.